Welcome to the first session of the 5th LS Friedman Conference. So our session is a debate on whether nationalism is good for liberty. Now, nationalism is defined as loyalty to one's own state. So nationalism appears to be gaining momentum across the Western world, so it's definitely a pertinent question. Now, for the affirmative side, starting affirmative side, we have Andie. Andie, and from Students for Liberty, Vice Chairperson, and Lee Herridge from Taken Liberties. And on negating, we have Bianca, Fundraising Director for ANZSFL, and Tim Wilms from the Unshackled. And so I'll call on to the stage. Who wants to go first? Bianca. Okay, sure. I'll go with the poll first. So if you agree with the question, can you put your hand up? The question is nationalism good for liberty?
Yeah.
Do unsure at the end. Yeah. If you're unsure.
Keep those hands all right.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
If you disagree?
Nice hand, nice hand. So I can say unsure, they'll be unsure, just so if you're not sure, keep your hand down. If you don't believe nationalism is good for liberty, put your hand up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 20.
Any unsures? Anyone unsure?
Nice. 16.
Cool. Yeah, we'll just keep track of those till the end to see if we had any changes. So I'll let the starting affirmative person, Bianca, go first. Good luck.
Hi. So I stand before you today with my Make America Great Again hat on, not because I'm confused as to what country I'm in, but because I celebrate what this hat represents. Trump's defeat of the Clinton establishment and the imperialist cronies that accomplished it echoes the resentment Western civilization holds for those that tell us that A, nations are insignificant or at worst imaginary, and B, all cultures are equal, and as a result, we must suppress pride in our own for fear of offending others. This resentment we saw taken to the polls in the US is echoed in Europe and is witnessed by the rise of Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France, the Alternative for Germany Party, Golden Dawn in Greece, Jobbik in Hungary, the Sweden Democrats, the Freedom Party in Austria, and the People's Party out of Slovakia, to name a few. Indeed, reflecting on the post-1945 climate of ideas and ethics, this trend has been closely intertwined with a growing tendency among some left-leaning academics to question both the significance and the legitimacy of the concept of a nation. This dismissiveness of a nation and the people who comprise it fundamentally misunderstands how the world works, past, present, and future. Scholars like Azar and Alexander Jacobson discuss how ethnic and national sentiments are evolutionarily ingrained in human nature in the form of people's propensity for affinity, solidarity, and mutual cooperation within their perceived kin culture communities. None of this is to suggest that any particular national identity or ethnicity is a given unchanging quantity, and identities have changed throughout history and they will continue to do so. Still, ethnic and national identities, while in flux, hold firm and have the ability to remain potent for centuries. We as libertarians might oppose this tendency to cling to one's culture and their ethnicity or ethnic identity. However, history has proven that this is indeed what humans have ingrained in their very nature. And if we are to remain champions of liberty, we must understand this. We cannot simply wish away reality. So today, I will put forward 4 key arguments as to why nationalism is good for liberty, but first I think it's important to discuss again what exactly nationalism is. So what is nationalism? It's the devotion to the interests of one's own nation, the desire for national independence, like what we've witnessed recently in Brexit. It cannot properly be understood without distinguishing a nation from a state. A nation is a group of people that have a shared identity, and that shared identity will most likely be based on a shared language, culture, heritage, and in some cases race. But a state, on the other hand, is a government body that holds the monopoly on the use of force within a given region. So just because more than one nation can be controlled by one state does not mean that that's exactly one nation. And as we've seen in Syria, Iraq, and the former Yugoslavia, this may be a recipe for disaster, as a house divided cannot stand on its own. Under this concept, it is therefore possible to have a nation without a state. So taken to its extreme, it's possible to have a nation that subscribes to anarchy. So this helps us to better understand what it means when it is said that nationalism is the devotion to one's nation, the desire for national advancement and independence, and the insistence on asserting the interests of a nation. Nationalism may therefore complement anti-statism, and I'll go further to argue why it is good for liberty. So 1, nationalism promotes unity through solidarity in a shared identity. As I stated before, identities change over time, and a nation does not merely have to be defined upon race or ethnicity. Some nations made up of Westerners, which is not race or ethnicity per se, subscribe to Western cultural identity that is the founding thought of liberal democracy and individual rights. This solidarity in a shared identity promotes social cohesion and facilitates the building of trust between individuals. Without a high trust society, you won't have the development of a significant capitalist class. And without this, you can kiss the manifestation of libertarian institutions goodbye. Furthermore, pursuing the belief that nations are imaginary lowers the individual to that of a mere empty vessel, no more than a means of production that has no identity, which sounds quite commie to me. 2, nationalism thrives within a system of voluntary association, proving how liberty itself creates the necessary condition for the preservation of nations. Libertarianism and nationalism are codependent. When people have the freedom to associate, they tend to flock around people that they share an identity with. A national identity and sense of brotherhood adds to the voluntary nature of libertarian thought. You will have a voluntary society only when you have a nation that is united around common principles such as liberty, individual rights, personal responsibility, the non-aggression principle, and the belief in the free market. You're not going to create or maintain this kind of society when you preach cultural relativism and force people to accept cultures that believe in state socialism or strict extremist versions of certain religions. 3, nationalism reminds us that we as libertarians must think of the bigger picture. With every right we hold inherently comes a duty to protect the rights of others. It reminds us that we are the custodians of our children's futures, and as such, we should preserve the very rights that provided the framework for us to flourish. We libertarians have a tendency to focus on ourselves and our own individual rights, but these rights mean nothing if we don't live in a like-minded society where everyone agrees relatively with your notion of what constitutes as being a fundamental right. Mutual agreement as to what classes as being a fundamental right will ensure that we better protect those of others and that others protect those of ours. 4th and finally, nationalism can indeed be, and definitely should be in order to thrive, anti-statist. If our state is selling out our national sovereignty and opening up our borders to foreign nations who don't share our common identity, are the very values of separation of church and state, individual liberty, and women's liberation not at risk? The biggest threat to national identity can and has been the state, And we've seen this in many Western countries with the dramatic increase in female genital mutilation, child marriages, and a new form of extremism that have all been imported and forced upon nations thanks to states. It is the denial of people's ability to uphold their national identity that leads people to supporting big government intervention, much like what we see with national security threats. Ignoring the importance of culture and a shared identity in society is the real threat to liberty. Nationalism has recently been receiving a bad rap in the media, as due to the rise of groups I mentioned earlier in Europe. And I think in large part this is due to the media's strong negative connotations drawn from people like Hitler and Stalin, with which they like to link nationalism with. This is a very simplistic way of viewing the world, and I think that it is important to understand that nationalism, National Socialism, Libertarianism, and Communism are all distinct, separate ideologies. National Socialism fails, Communism is deemed to fail. However, the fusion of nationalism and libertarianism, or Western civilization, is a legacy that will live on. In order to safeguard liberty, we should instead seek to understand human nature and reality in order to ensure that our ideas don't become irrelevant. This conference has been organised by Students for Liberty in conjunction with the Australian Libertarian Society, a group that combines national identity with libertarianism because it is indeed possible to do so. Thank you. I now pass over to the next speaker.
Cool. So I'll have the first negating speaker.
Good morning, all. I'm exceedingly happy to be in front of such a great crowd of West Australians. Okay, so I'm here to speak against the notion that nationalism is good for liberty. And I want to begin by asking, to figure out whether nationalism is good for liberty, you have to figure out, well, what is good for liberty? And you have to begin to answer that question by figuring out, well, what is liberty about? And it's fundamentally, at its core, a system of thinking and acting, with voluntary interactions between individuals. So it's a system centred on giving individuals the freedom to think and act as they see fit, so long as they don't violate the equal rights of others. So if we want to understand if nationalism is good for liberty, we need to consider to what extent does nationalism comport with promoting and supporting the freedom of individuals to think and act as they see fit, as long as they respect the equal rights of others. So does nationalism do that? Well, let's look at a definition of nationalism. So according to the Macquarie Dictionary, it's a noun. Nationalism is a noun with a bunch of definitions. So it's a national spirit or aspirations, devotion to the interests of one's own nation, a desire for national advancement or independence, the policy of asserting the interests of a nation viewed as separate from the interests of other nations or the common interests of all nation, or the extreme fanatical devotion to one's own nation. So from that definition, and most of the other definitions of the dictionary are pretty similar, what is nationalism about? Well, it's really about the supremacy of the nation, loyalty and devotion, national spirit, asserting the interests of your nation against the interests of other nations. Now, you might notice there's something missing from those definitions if you sort of think carefully about it. Did anybody catch what was missing from those definitions in terms of liberty? What might be essential to liberty? Well, it's... Anybody? The individual. Yes! Give that man a prize. The individual, that's what's missing. We don't hear in those definitions about the individual. So if liberty is about individuals acting and thinking freely, where does that leave nationalism? Well, there's, we have kind of two places to go. Either somehow in some sort of Borg-like situation, the interests of every individual is sort of somehow simultaneously in the sole interest of the nation, or the rights of the individual have to give way to the the interests of the nation. So every individual has their own purpose. I mean, if we did a survey of every person in this room of what they're interested, what they're looking to achieve, would end up with, 60 different ideas of how to live their life and what they want to live their life for. But the nation, as we can conceive it, as it's conceived, only has a single purpose or a single way of acting. And so you've got a zero-sum game. Either the individual has to give way to the nation, or the nation has to give way to the individual. So let's go to the perennial bugbear of the nationalists. Let's go to immigration. So Ronald Reagan said that a nation that cannot control its borders is not a nation. But what does it mean to control its borders? Well, what it usually means is to stop one group of people from trading or in some way voluntarily associating with another group of people. So if you want to buy an incandescent lamp from China, from a Chinese factory run by Chinese people, well, tough luck. Malcolm Turnbull said, no, you can't do that. That's against the interests of the nation. You want to hire someone freely from overseas or invite them to come and live in accommodation that you've built? Well, no, you can't really do that freely either. We even have national interest tests, courtesy of the Financial Investment Review Board, just to make sure you have rigorous analysis to decide whether you can trade with some foreigners. So this is where we find the first big problem of nationalism. Nationalism, at its heart, is a collectivist ideology. It subjugates individuals and sacrifices their interests for the sake of the nation. You as an individual play second fiddle to the interests of the nation. And we'll get to, we'll take that question now. What is the nation, you ask? Who gets to decide what is in the national interest? Well, the nation is not here in this room. It's not you, it's not me, it's not even us, really. It's sort of us, in the sense it's kind of the aggregate of everyone. But you can't sort of put it in a room, you can't get it together. It's an abstract, nebulous thing, and abstract and nebulous things can't act, they can't think, they can't do. So we create this fiction called power to the people. We have elections, we have all these systems, but in the end, the group that really gets to decide what is in the national interest is the state. So Barney Frank, who's a US congressman, he bailed the cat on that one by saying government is simply the name we give to the things we choose to do together. The state is the reality behind the nebulous fiction of the nation. It is the very real knife put to the throat of the individual in the name of the greater good. And so here we find the second problem with nationalism. Concepts of the nation necessitate a state to act on the nation's behalf, which in turn will violate the interests of individuals. And so we come to the third problem for nationalism, which is that the state becomes subverted by private interests for their own gain. So once you have a state to decide what is in the national interest, you have a perfect value for special interest to co-opt that, to say, well, this thing I want you to do, and for the sake of the nation, this is the good thing, this is the right thing. So libertarians talk about the bootleggers and Baptist theory of government, of public choice, drawing on the imagery, if you're not familiar with it, it's drawing on the imagery of alcohol prohibition in America, where you had this situation where you had on one hand the high-minded moralists, the people promoting virtue and goodness, things like how great West Australia is, this wonderful place, this wonderful land, and the Baptists, we call them the Baptists, well they actually were Baptists, but and you also had the profit-minded opportunists, the people who are going to benefit materially from it, the bootleggers, the people who are brewing illegal alcohol and then selling it. And so these two unlikely forces come together to subvert the national interest for their own benefit. The moralists feel good about themselves, the opportunists profit. And we see that in history throughout. If you go to any press release for any policy, it is almost always going to be in the national interest. Be it trade policy, be it immigration policy, whatever it is. Climate change, immigration, trade, whatever it is. All these people are promoting the national interest. Every election is no surprise that politicians want you to support them in the national interest. And the fact that you cannot define the national interest is the winning thing. You can't figure it out because you can't go, it's not like there's stone tablets that say, here is decreed the national interest. It's not like Moses brought it down from the mountain. It doesn't mean anything. Literally, there is nothing that is the national interest. It is defined by the people who want to promote certain things. So in these three ways, we find that nationalism is inconsistent with the principles of liberty. It's a collectivist ideology that guarantees a state that will use the rhetoric of national interest to promote plunder and privilege. And I'd finish by referring you to the great and well-known communist, Margaret Thatcher, who said, it's a joke, please, God, it's a joke. I know she's not a communist. Who said there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and there's only family.
Thanks, Lee. I'll now call on the responding affirmative.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you for Students for Liberty for putting on this debate. It's very exciting to be part of it. First, I'd just like to respond to some of Lee's arguments. So he talks about that nationalism is a separate ideology from libertarianism because the dictionary definition doesn't talk about the individual as well. Well, in my speech today, I'm going to argue that nationalism complements liberty. They might be different, but they can work together. In response to his points, I agree with him that free trade is important, but immigration is different because if somebody imports somebody from overseas to work in their shop, that's not just a private contract. There's other people who live in that community and surroundings who will be affected by that person who's coming into that community who might not share their values or respect the rule of law. So trading with somebody is different from living next to somebody. And you also talked about the problems with government, the corruption, the centralised power. I think you're confusing statism with nationalism, which in my speech I will respond to and differentiate. So I'll now move on to my speech. Lee, a lot of the other points that he raised are actually in my speech, so there'll be a lot of rebuttal to that as well. So libertarianism is the philosophy that all of us up here at least adhere to. I know that in the audience today there's a lot of mixed feelings about libertarianism, but we've all come here to learn. So libertarianism, its cornerstones are the non-aggression principle, free markets, individual liberty, and voluntary association. But libertarianism is strictly a political philosophy, meaning it only describes the relationship between the individual and the state. Within that, it promotes a system of negative rights, meaning that it's what the government can't do or the people in control of government can't do to an individual if we are to have a free society. Because libertarianism is only about the relationship between the individual and the state, it provides no guidance into how an individual should personally live their lives or what is the ideal society. So this explains why libertarians spend so much time disagreeing with each other, because we all have a different view about what type of culture, morals or values will build that libertarian society that we all want. I'll start by going into my argument by talking about we're debating the path to a libertarian society, which we all have a different idea about. And it's fair to say that we are all far from that libertarian society. Libertarianism is all about the individual, but in society, a person is not an isolated individual, only concerned with themselves and wants to be alone all the time. They crave relationships with other people. They're always looking for something bigger than themselves, a sense of belonging. You only have to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Belonging is number 3 on it. And they also want a sense of personal achievement in life. They want pride in their personal surroundings and in their communities. So nationalism can both fulfill an individual's desire to have a sense of belonging, but not just that, it can be a movement that actually protects individual liberty. So I'd like to respond to one of the myths about nationalism, which is about worshipping the state. I prefer to think of nationalism, yes, it is about looking after the people in your nation, but think of it as the same as looking after the people in your local community, or take it down to an even more personal level, your family and friends. You want your community and the people close to you to have the highest possible living standards, to be able to live free from aggression from others. You want to be able to look after each other when times are tough, and individuals to have mutually beneficial relationships with each other based on voluntary association. These are the values of liberty. These have nothing to do with empowering a centralised state. Other states have actually oppressed nationalism, oppressed people who share the same values. I mean, you just have to think about what the Soviet Union did to its republics, especially what it did to Ukraine. And you also have to look at the fate of the Kurds, who, without any form of community, they're divided by national boundaries. So they're essentially a lost people. And of course, Bianca mentioned what happened when people of different culture and values were forced to live together in one state under Yugoslavia. And we all saw how that ended. But we saw that once they were able to live separately from each other, the area is much more peaceful now. Now, the reason why nationalism is often connected to the state is because we live in a world where every single piece of land on this planet is connected to a state. So, of course, nationalism is going to be defined by a nation, but nationalism is also consistent with the most radical form of libertarianism, which is anarcho-capitalism, because in an anarcho-capitalist society, you're still going to have communities of people with the same values and culture wanting to live together and congregate and only be around people like that. And we see gated communities even existing under a state system. Now, all of us, by looking after the welfare of those close to us and wanting our communities to thrive, are living under the values of nationalism. Now, I doubt there's anyone here who thinks that looking after your community and your friends and family first is a bad thing. This is all consistent with the philosophy of individualism, and also by wanting to better our communities, we're also wanting to benefit our own lives too. When individuals succeed, nations succeed. The reason that I believe that nationalism has got such a bad reputation is because those who adhere to it are very alert to the threats to our society, and they take pride in their society. And I would argue they're probably the most alert to threats to liberty. As you'll all be aware, there are thousands of ideologies that do not represent the concept of liberty. They do not respect the right of the individual to pursue their own life goals, do not lead to societies that are prosperous or safe. Nationalists quite rightly want to keep these foreign ideologies out. But it is not about hate for no reason or simple bigotry. It is about protecting what is great about our communities, nations, about our surroundings, and having a sense of pride in it. The only way you preserve what is good about your community is making sure that the people entering it share your values, and hence why some form of immigration control between nations and communities is justified. Now, libertarians also have a tendency to be cultural relativists. They believe that any form of lifestyle, culture and values is fine, but it seems to me that doesn't apply to nationalism. There's a lot of libertarians who believe this of everything else but not nationalism. But as I've said, people are always looking for something bigger than themselves to be a part of. And the arguments that I've just raised about nationalism, about taking pride and striving for the best, is probably one of the least destructive ideologies there are. And by demonising nationalism, you're leading people into more destructive and nihilistic ideologies. For example, if you perpetrate the idea that Australia was built on racism and genocide, which has become so entrenched in a lot of Australians and migrants, it is no surprise that they turn to other more destructive ideologies such as Islamism, environmentalism, cults such as Scientology, and of course, communism and socialism. It should be emphasised that nationalism is not an ideology that forces you to do anything. So far, there is no proposal to make going to an Australia Day barbecue compulsory or attending the dawn service on Anzac Day compulsory. Nationalism is not another form of collectivism. It is a movement, not a grand central plan that everyone follows. And I know that people say, well, what about National Socialism? Well, that was simply socialism. That was about as anti-freedom as you could get. The modern nationalist movement is all about protecting freedom. I mean, you look at the Patriot movement in the United States, they are the people who are most sceptical of government and want it to be as small as possible and want to be able to live in their communities in peace without interference. That's just something to consider. Those not in their community, and this or in their nation, it should also be justified, they want to leave alone. Most patriots, nationalists are non-interventionists overseas. Sure, they may not like the way that people on the other side of the world live their lives, but if that's their choice to live that way, then they want to leave them alone. Just don't come over to our side of the world and interfere with how we want to live. So it's actually a system where we're actually respecting how different groups live their lives. We're just choosing to live together in separate nations and communities. So nationalism is definitely an ideology that can complement liberty. Nationalism is about wanting your community to be the best, better than the rest. Therefore, it fosters competition between nations, which improves our standard of living and sense of pride in ourselves and our community. It is not a zero-sum game. I mean, we as libertarians, we all know the benefits of competition, market forces. If countries are competing with each other with being the best, if America does become great again, then that's an incentive for Australia to aim to be even greater. It is a positive ideology. It is about progress, human achievement, about celebrating life and humanity. Libertarians should see nationalism as a philosophy that complements liberty and also protects it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Can I have the negating responding, Andie? Thanks.
Hi everyone. So you can tell by my accent, I'm from New Zealand. I'm one of the only non-Australians on the panel. I think I am. I've got a lot in common with you guys. You guys are all libertarians, so you'll share your values, but we're from different countries. I'm not from here. I'm not born here. I've been here for a year now. Like, I've got a different accent and everything, but I share a lot with you guys. Like, I'm not from your nation, but I feel a lot in common with you. You guys all believe in freedom. You believe in the right to be left alone. We share a lot. So we're not necessarily distinct just because we're from these different borders. We have a lot in common, and that's the important thing, is that we're both bonding, because we both have different values which transcend borders. So one of the first questions we raised in the debate on the negating side was the question of what actually is the nation, because the nation's been repeated a lot throughout the speech, and it seems a bit like the common good. It's a bit of it's almost a non-concept. It's often non-defined, and it filters through political debate as this kind of rhetorical device. The idea that nations necessarily embody like shared values isn't necessarily true. Most of the idea of the nation is defined by borders, by the idea that everyone is born within a certain amount of territory, and this kind of ideas of shared values are reinforced through state education. So the distinctness of the idea of like nations aren't necessarily defined uniquely by having shared values. It's mainly being born within the same set of territory, and that's kind of the point I want to lead off. The main idea about nationalism is their devotion towards the nation, to people supposedly in your community who live local to you. But the issue is it also implies supremacy. So it's the supremacy of people close to you. It's that because we're born in the same territory and supposedly then have the same values, we and within these borders are of more importance. We're of more moral significance. And that's a bit of a problem. Throughout classical liberal thought, one of the key ideas, and now libertarian thought, is that all humans are morally significant, despite our culture, despite where we're born, despite our circumstances. We all have the same rights to life, liberty, and property, and that's what John Locke preached. He said that we're all equal in the social contract and state of nature. One of the main ideas about nationalism is indeed, no, you're not all equal. Like you arrive within a country and you don't get you don't get all the same rights as everyone else. You get preference for work. Like if we look at restrictions on work visas and the amount of time you can stay within a country, we see that there's actually a preference to people who live local, and that impinges on the idea of significant equals. And we look further. We look at examples of war where we bomb countries with national interests or security, or supposedly for our own security's sake. We treat civilians as if they're not as equal or morally significant as people local to us. We say, for the sake of our own defence, we can kill civilians. And this stems from the idea of nationalism, that people close to us are supreme and that they're more important, and that's completely liberal. And further, the idea of nationalism, we've heard a lot from the negating side, is the bond to the nation. So we're bound to this kind of cultural construct within our borders. And we have duties, so we've got responsibilities. But the issue which hasn't been touched on, and there's been a lot of attempts to disconnect the state from the nation, is that the current state is meant to embody the nation. So the values that we share in society, the way that the modern liberal state works, is it's meant to embody and enforce the values of the nation. So that's why we see with debates like gay marriage, we see people people going for gay marriage on the idea that our values should represent equality. We see people going against it because it should embody traditionalism. The way that the state works is it embodies responsibilities in our society. So when we have ideas that we should have duties to people first, that necessarily becomes embodied in the state. When people say we need to look after ourselves first before others, that then gets embodied in the voting population. We then see protectionist laws come through because people want themselves protected first, they're local people. So the idea that they're necessarily disconnected, in theory that might work, but in a nation, in a world of states, it's inevitable that they collide. And further, the idea that we're bonded by the idea of being born in the same territory and nation, that's not even the first and foremost libertarian view. If we look at thinkers like Adam Smith, the whole idea behind Adam Smith's philosophy, who's the father of modern economics and liberalism, was that we are bound by exchange, by the idea that we're free individuals who trade on interests. We aren't necessarily bound by being born within the same borders, which is what a nation is defined by. We're bound because we either have similar cultures or similar interests. And the idea of free interests and free values doesn't have to exist within nationalism. We don't need nationalism to have values. And we don't need nationalism to have community. We're bound by our religious status, we have if I can take two quite disparate examples, we have examples like evangelical churches or Catholic churches or Orthodox churches, religious institutions, they bound us by our belief, not necessarily by our nation. So that's an example of people coming together on their faith or their traditions or their values, and they don't necessarily need borders to look after each other. And they don't need it enforced either. And we look on the other hand, examples like the women's collectives or queer communities. We see people who have similar interests or similar beliefs or similar circumstances look after themselves according to their commonalities. So people don't need to be born within the same borders and feel an affinity to that to have a stable valued society. You can simply just have it on normal human interests. And I'd like to come to some rebuttals now. So the opposition of nationalism does not have to be socialism. And the idea that the oppression of nationalism is an example of the authoritarianism of anti-national sentiment, I don't think is correct. USSR was brought up as an example. USSR was fiercely nationalist, especially under Stalin's rule. So it kind of goes both ways. There are very authoritarian examples of nationalism as well. And in fact, the idea of nationalism was largely brought in as quite an authoritarian, was kind of brought into public discourse as a very authoritarian idea. Times when nationalism is exaggerated or exacerbated is in times of war, when governments want to unite everyone. They want to bring everyone together and mobilise them for purposes of force or state interests. And that's also the issue. Like, how can you mobilise a whole load of individuals with disparate values? Now, libertarians, we know how to do that. That's the market. We know that we can have everyone trade, everyone freely associate. But the idea that everyone within Australia holds this kind of like bedrock of stable values, it's not correct. Like, everyone is completely different, and you see that in politics. Everyone is divided because they see everything is so different. So this is hardly even a nation. Nationalism can hardly even stand because there's no coherent idea of what a country's values are. And the idea to see nationalism as protection of rights, nationalism is often used for coercion. It's often used to impose your values on others. The idea was brought up before that it's supposedly anti-freedom to have people with different values living next to you, and that's enforced on you. That's an example of the government coming in to infringe on free association. And the idea that nationalism is pro-liberty because it stops people from imposing their values on you. Indeed, in the idea of borders, nationalism comes in and stops you from being left alone. it stops people from buying property where they want. We came to the question of borders very briefly. How long do I have left, sorry? 3 minutes. We came to the question of borders very briefly about whether we should be importing people with different values. The idea that, so the question of we importing, so we use, the term we was used. When we mean we mean the government, like should the government force or not? Which is again an issue of nationalism. Nationalism being conflated with the state. We're saying like, should we as the people, again we the people, with these certain values, let these other people with different values come in and buy property? We're using, we, individuals, people like libertarians or libertarian conservatives are advocating for their installation of these nationalist feelings through the government, through force. It shows that there's actually a massive overlap between nationalist sentiment and statist sentiment. So often they are conflicting. We shouldn't be limiting people from buying up property where they want or living where they want. That's completely anti-freedom. It's against the non-aggression principle and against principles of private property. Checking what sports left. Yeah, it's an infringement on the private affairs of others. And also, the idea too was brought up very briefly of Western civilization, the values of Western civilization being pro-liberty. There's lots of pro-liberty thought in non-Western civilizations. There are, contrary to belief, because it gets thrown out a lot of the time, there are quite a few Confucian philosophers who uphold very libertarian values. Many indigenous communities have held up very libertarian values. We look at Native American tribes with almost anarchist-like societies with exchanges of private property and trade, which has been going on for a long, long, long time. We don't need to conflate Western civilization with liberty. Liberty is quite a universal thought, and it comes in many different civilizations. And that Western civilization hasn't always been that pro-liberty. I mean, we were lucky to have the influx of liberal thought. Thank you. We were lucky to have the influx of liberal thought in Britain. But if we want to look at the societies which were dominant in Europe for a long, long time and still are bits of Eastern Europe, which are still part of the Western world, societies of hierarchy, the great chain of being, feudal titles, which had been going in some countries through the state and through like religious influence till the 1900s, we can see that Western civilization was not entirely pro-freedom either. In fact, we need to kind of disassociate civilization and freedom. We need to see freedom as a philosophy that individuals believe in and individuals uphold. What we are trying to sum up today is that we're all important as individuals. We're all important as people with connection to people through trade. We see value in other people. We don't see value through borders. We don't see people's values through state enforcement. And we also see the eventually necessary consequence that is that nationalism gets embodied in the state. So whether we really want to have a kind of incoherent ideology of shared values based on borders in the liberty movement, probably not. We want a limited government and we want people to be defined just by their individualism and their free trade. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Andie. And so that wraps up the debate part of the session. Just for the sake of measurement, I guess, let's go with the poll again. So people, after hearing all this, people that are for the question, which is nationalism good for liberty? Against? And unsure. Cool. So yeah, we've got about 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So yeah, if you have any questions, please.
Sorry, we're just going to do that at the end.
Yeah, maybe. Sure. Yeah, start with it.
Your rebuttal address the point of threats to liberty, external threats to liberty, and that was something that I think you firmly covered really well, was that, and sort of my position on nationalism is that it's not the correct end, but it's a necessary means to an end in a world where there are, you mentioned that liberty is a universal value that comes from a lot of... Yeah, sure. You mentioned that liberty is a universal value that can come from a lot of different cultures, not just Western civilization, but I think Western civilization is the biggest and most successful embodiment of libertarian values. And you didn't address that there are a lot of cultures that are the antithesis of liberty, and they are a threat to more libertarian cultures like ours. So I wanted to see if you had any thoughts to add to that.
Thank you. No, thank you for pulling me up on that. So my kind of response would be that cultures are not necessarily, people coming from certain cultures are not necessarily illibertarian by coming from those cultures. The kind of idea of external threats, with the idea, within classical liberal thought, there was never really the idea that regulation should stop people from coming in, simply coming from a certain culture. It was that, once they actually commit a crime or commit violence, that is when they should be prosecuted. You should not bring in blanket regulation of people based on culture. I don't necessarily think nationalism is needed to simply... I don't think nationalism really needed to kind of liberalise people. I don't think we need to have pride in the nation so much. I think actually integrating people in a globalised world where we have people meeting one another and seeing their values kind of leads to a more tolerant society generally. So when we have people, for example, who are... we'll use the example of Islamism, which is pertinent, I'm assuming you guys are quite passionate about. The way that we bring people in to get convinced of the ideas of secularism is by believing that as Muslims, they are most respected, and by respecting other people, and by having the government left out of their lives. And that can only be recognised by free discussion and freedom of movement, where we integrate people into societies and meet with them and talk about values. So I would say you don't necessarily need you don't need nationalist ideology to liberalise people, if that kind of answers your question.
So I think again, yeah. Sorry, I won't take too much more time, but I sort of think you're still skirting around the issue because you're talking about, you mentioned Islamism, but that is a movement where people are coming together to promote values like Sharia law, which is antithetical to freedom. So it's not just individuals coming in with different ideas in a tolerant mixed society. It's people coming in potentially en masse and gathering together with the intent to change society towards their values. And a lot of people see that as a legitimate threat.
You go first. Maybe we'll have response from you guys as well.
So, in the libertarian framework, the only legitimate reason to interfere in the rights of another person is if there is some sort of aggression or coercion or some sort of interference in my free exercise of my rights. And people just thinking different thoughts doesn't fit that criteria. So just because there are people out there who think that everybody should be Muslim, or everybody should be a Christian, or everybody should, support the farmers, or everybody should buy Australian cars, those things are not inherently a reason to then interfere in their rights. And I think that's kind of really what is the claim here. I mean, really, it's an accusation of thought crime. People think bad thoughts. We can't have people thinking bad thoughts come to our country. Well, there's lots of bad thoughts. There's an infinite array of thoughts that are bad and that are anti-liberal. Even in amongst Australians. I mean, the whole reason the libertarian movement struggles is because we've got a country awash with terrible ideas. Are we going to start throwing them out of the country? Are we going to say to an American as they come across the border, oh, you can't be a protectionist, you have to love free speech. I mean, Donald Trump is, Hillary Clinton, actually, I'll pick on her, she's against free speech. I mean, that was one of the things that Trumpians promote, oh, she's against free speech. Well, are we going to stop Hillary Clinton from coming to Australia? If there is an actual... I mean, the only libertarian reason to keep lots of Muslims, for example, out of the country is if there's actually a credible threat that they're going to lead some sort of armed insurrection against the country. If it's just that they think bad thoughts, that's not good enough from a libertarian framework. From a nationalist framework, that's good enough, but not from a libertarian framework. Now, if the charge is they're going to come and vote differently, well, again, the same issue of bad thoughts is there, but that's an issue to do with the state. I mean, the libertarian framework says you shouldn't be arguing about these things. There should be no votes on that sort of stuff. If there is to be a state, it is to be purely for the protection of property, purely for the protection of rights. So that's an issue for statism, welfare state, all that kind of stuff. That's a separate argument. And I'm sure if we talked about the welfare state, every single one of us here would say, let's dump the welfare state.
And we're not disagreeing with that at all. So,
I think, yeah, also to kind of recontextualise your question, like there might, if there is a credible threat, we are talking about credible threat to property as well and individuals. So, like if there was a sure and definite crime which could be committed by someone entering a country, like you knew that if someone entered, that they would commit a crime, they commit violence against someone, that in a liberal framework, that can work. But the nationalist response would be to talk about within the national interest and to say we don't want people with different values engaging in discourse or dialogue. So the question of violence would certainly come into a liberal framework, but again, a libertarian framework would not say you cannot enter and engage in discussion with them. There'd be an issue of kind of free speech.
Yeah,
but
it's thought crime. It's essentially stopping people.
it's stopping people on the basis of thought crime, and that's not good enough in libertarianism.
Do you guys have anything to say?
It's a bit more than stopping people coming in because they have bad thoughts. I mean, in Australia, like obviously we're not all libertarians, but we're libertarian enough. I mean, we're allowed to hold this conference in peace. The government hasn't got any spies here reporting us to the security agencies. But the reason why I come down to is why immigration control is justified and on libertarian grounds is because not every single space of land in Australia is private property. I mean, the public land that we're on that we share is owned by all of us. And so we are why we do have a nation state, which, as I said, I'm open to the idea of anarcho-capitalism where every bit of property is private. But where we do have this public land, we should have the right to decide if we do think that people from overseas are going to be a threat to our values and our freedoms, like to hold this conference, then I think it's okay to say that, okay, we don't want certain types of people from other lands to come into our shared communities. I mean, that's why I also had the objection bringing in someone from overseas to work in your shop. It's because they're going on to a public land shared by everybody, so they're not being kept on simply private land as well. And I would also raise another thing that it's not just thought crime. We're seeing in Europe, there's terrorist attacks occurring every month. There's heaps of suburbs especially in France, under Sharia law. So it's not just people who are just have different thoughts.
Yeah, so we'll just go to one more question because we're just short on time. So if you can answer this quickly, that'd be good. Yeah.
Thanks. So it seems to me the affirmative is equivocating between understanding the nation state in a liberal context, so certain values, liberal values that you want to protect, and the traditional understanding of nationalism, which is an ethnic nationalism, and that's certainly what's in Europe, and to a certain extent, aspects of it here in Australia and in the United States. So it seems to me you might be able to be comfortable with a liberal nationalism in the sense that we're defending certain liberal values, but it seems very different to say that we're going to defend certain, we're going to prevent certain religions, different languages, skin colors, country of origin type stuff seems a different kind of thing altogether. So I'd like to hear just a little bit of a distinction between the ethnic nationalism, which is the traditional version, and a liberal kind of nationalist.
Was this to any particular side?
Liberal nationalists are not opposed to immigration, period, because some of the most, I would say, enthusiastic Australian nationalists, for example, are immigrants themselves. So we welcome people who come here and share our values. And I'm certainly not a person that subscribes to ethno-nationalism. Like, I don't mind, seeing on the streets people of different races. That doesn't bother me.
Yeah, I would.
Other races? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Liberal, right? Yeah, liberal.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I'm more of a civic nationalist in the sense that I think that it's different to judge people based on racial features or things that they're inherently born with as opposed to what they believe in, which is something that they choose freely themselves. And also coming back to when Lee was talking about this being a cultural issue, I definitely agree. It's not so much an economic issue because we agree a lot when it comes to diminishing the welfare state as such. But I think that the non-aggression principle is indeed being breached over in Europe, and we can learn from that here in Australia as commonly coming under the banner of Western civilization. And I don't think it's appropriate for us to sit here and sing Kumbaya until a caliphate comes to friggin' behead us. I think that we have the right to defend our nation and our views.
We're really running a long time, but you got 30 seconds.
So, I'm sure Tim and Bianca wholeheartedly agree in the liberal order. Like, I love both of them, and I agree. You know, I'm not going to call them communists or anything. But I think the issue is that they don't get to set the rules all the time. So the whole problem with having a national interest, as I said before, there's not a stone, it's not coming down from God on stone tablets to be forever, installed. You have to create a system where somebody has to decide what is the national interest. And ethno-nationalists can organise the vote just as well as anybody else. So by creating this notion of a national interest, you're essentially creating the opportunity for people to subvert that national interest and to turn it towards the ends of ethno-nationalism and racism and any form of other ideology that is anti-freedom. So it's not enough to just say, well, we like a liberal order, we don't want an ethno-nationalist order. You have to have a system that works, and the system that we have is not, nationalism is not good to throw into that mix.
Okay, and yeah, so we'll just leave it there. So with the poll, the good news is both sides have managed to convince people. But the winners are the affirmative side. So yeah, if we can give our panel one more round of applause and then we'll move on to the next.